number one, and these are in no particular order, but number one is Operation Paperclip. Now this was a secret for, I believe it was declassified in the mid to late 70s, and through the Freedom of Information Act in the US. And what it is after war, it's unbelievable, but after World War II, basically the Nazis had got such a jump on America and the world scientifically. They were so far ahead, and that's how one country managed to almost take over half the world, right? America and the Soviet Union and Britain, which we'll get to in a minute, but Operation Paperclip is the CIA's formally classified project, which was to bring in about 1,500 Nazi scientists, many of whom are war criminals, many of whom were, or quite a few of whom were involved in, were perpetrators of the Holocaust. They were brought into America, they were Americanized, they were given citizenships, their families came too. In many cases, in the worst cases where they were extreme Nazi criminals, war criminals, they were, in many cases, they were given, they had their names changed to hide that from not only the American people, but actually it was President Truman who signed off on this document, but said no known war criminals are allowed in. But the CIA circumvented that by changing certain names. So what you have here with Operation Paperclip is 100%, it's an absolute conspiracy, but it's a fact, documented, CIA admits to it. And what's quite fascinating is to consider when you let in that many scientists from the Nazi regime, I find it fascinating to consider what wider implications that might have had, considering they were in charge of certain projects which we're going to get to, such as mind control. They were also heavily involved in NASA, which many people know, but they're also involved in biological warfare projects post-World War II in the US. So I find it fascinating to consider what implications there are in letting in that many Nazis and putting them in charge of major projects where you would have, in many instances, you would have thousands or tens of thousands of people taking orders from them, working under them, working alongside them. And I believe that sort of mindset may have spread, but that's me theorizing off that. But to go back to the absolute fact, Operation Paperclip was formally classified, now mostly declassified, and 100% proven. You can look it up, and the US let in that many Nazis. Now, to me, that is absolutely crazy. I don't need to be an American to say that is extremely un-American, everything against the Constitution, and it's just ridiculous that the amount of ex-military or ex-intelligence people I've spoken to just sort of think, wow, this was no big deal. Their argument is it was a Cold War battle because the Russians, which I'll come to in a minute, or the Soviets, should I say, had their own program where they were grabbing Nazis. So the excuse is, I should say, well, we had to do something. The Soviets were getting there first, but no, there's many options besides working with Nazis. Now, so I mentioned earlier that there were other, besides the US, the Soviets had Operation, can't quite pronounce it, but it's Operation Osoviakum. And so that was the Soviets equivalent, which was quite a bit smaller than Paperclip. And it was mainly to do with rocketry. Possibly they've declassified more, and maybe it's as extensive as Paperclip, but it seems to be a smaller one. But so they did the same thing, and that was hidden from the Russian people for a long time as well. Then you've got a much lesser known one called Operation Matchbox, and that was actually primarily British, but it stretched out into Canada and Australia. So really you've got the British Commonwealth. And the reason the Nazis came down to some of them were sent down to Australia is the British believed it was too sensitive to have these Nazis in Britain after the war. So some of them were doing experiments in the Australian outback. God knows, whether they were experimenting on Aboriginal peoples or what, I don't know. But there's a lot of space out there for them to do any number of experiments. So to summarize all that, Operation Paperclip, look it up, guys. It'll blow your mind, and it makes you think, wow, would US soldiers and the rest of the Allies who fought so hard and gave up their lives or saw their friends die in their arms, would they now be rolling in their graves thinking, what? We collaborated with the Nazis post-World War II. For me, it's a black and white subject, that one. It is anti the freedoms that we've fought for.